And good evening, Summa Scholars. Sunday evening, too. I've just wrapped up my Sunday festivities and eating and drinking and whatnot. And let's see if we can knock out a daily Summa here before retiring into evening things. We are on question 25, Article 3, which is what we started yesterday, moving into the on the contrary from Article 3 and the end of Objection 4. And the question is whether God is omnipotent. Let us continue. Nothing, therefore, is impossible. But if we take away the impossible, then we destroy also the necessary. For what necessarily exists is impossible not to exist. Therefore, there would be nothing at all that is necessary in things if God were omnipotent. But this is an impossibility. Therefore, God is not omnipotent. Okay, we're going to skip past these crazy guys' convoluted questions, and we're just going to go straight into Thomas's answers. On the contrary, Thomas says, it is said, no word shall be impossible with God. Luke 1:37, no word shall be impossible with God. Here is the logical or rational answer. That was the argument from authority. Let's hear the more rational argument. Thomas says, I answer that. All confess that God is omnipotent. It's a pretty good way to start. But it seems difficult to explain in what his omnipotence precisely consists, for there may be doubt as to the precise meaning of the word all, when we say that God can do all things. If, however, we consider the matter aright, since power is said in reference to possible things, this phrase, God can do all things, is rightly understood to mean that God can do all things that are possible, and for this reason he is said to be omnipotent. It's probably good to stop there and say that I heard, I think it was Rabbi David Gottlieb once talk about this, in that skeptics will say, can God win a chess game with only the king on the table, or whatever? Can God pick up a rock he cannot? Can God make a rock he can't pick up? All that silly stuff that people say. Not understanding, of course, obviously they don't understand theology. They're just saying stuff that because they're skeptics and they don't really understand what they're saying. They're just wanting to try to kind of push the idea of God away. But the idea is that God is just. In the whole of Scripture, in the whole of the divine revelation, we see that God is just. What does just mean? Justice. Like in the old word processors where you'd hit the word justify and it would straighten the columns out on the word on the page. To be just is to straighten things out. As Scripture says, the heavens declare the justice of God. In what way do the heavens declare the justice of God? You don't look up in the heavens and see some kind of court case or something, because courts and justice in the normal way we think of the word justice is only one of the manifestations of justice. The courtroom and legal battles is not justice. It's one of the manifestations of justice. And what justice is getting things working in proper order in relation to all the constituent elements and all the other parts. So it could very truly, using the actual word justice and what it really means, you could say that a doctor is justifying a person's body, or a chiropractor is justifying a person's skeletal system. So justice is making things work right. God can do all things, of course, but he is just and he is true. He also cannot lie. So to ask if God can win a chess game with only the king is essentially a ridiculous statement, because it is not just. It is not in line with the right order of things that he himself has set in order, and it would be a lie to say so. So asking if God can win a chess game that with only the king is asking a question without understanding the full implications of what the deity means, even in the Aristotelian way of looking at it, not even talking about Judaism and Christianity. That being itself is what we're seeing manifest before us, and there's certain rational laws of nature, and those things are manifestations of the deity. All right, so we could get into meta questions, which I think I've heard Alex O'Connor get into, like, could God create a world in which murder was permissible? But again, that's beyond the purview of the daily Summa. We're just going through a catechesis for beginners, so let's ride on through it. But that's enough to just put that in your mind and get you thinking about those things. All right, so now according to the philosopher, which is Aristotle, a thing is said to be possible in two ways. First, in relation to some power. Thus, whatever is subject to human power is said to be possible to man. Second, absolutely, on account of the relation in which the very terms stand to each other. Now, God cannot be said to be omnipotent through being able to do all things that are possible to created nature, for the divine power extends farther than that. If, however, we were to say that God is omnipotent because he can do all things that are possible to his power, there would be a vicious circle in explaining the nature of his power. For this would be saying nothing else but that God is omnipotent, because he can do all that he is able to do. All right, next paragraph. It remains, therefore, that God is called omnipotent because he can do all things that are possible absolutely, which is the second way of saying a thing is possible. For a thing is said to be possible or impossible absolutely according to the relation in which the very terms stand to one another. Possible if the predicate is not incompatible with the subject. So that Socrates sits, and absolutely possible when the predicate is altogether incompatible with the subject, as for instance, that man is a donkey. That's essentially using other examples to say what I just said. It's possible to do all that is actually in keeping with justice. We don't say that a man is a donkey unless we're saying it comedically, rhetorically, ad hominemly, or something like that. But we don't say that because it is a ridiculous statement. So God is able to do all that he actually is. Another way of thinking about it might be to say that can Craig naturally do what is I keep thinking of characters that we all know, but they're characters. I'm trying to avoid famous people. Taylor Swift, there we go. Can Craig do Taylor Swift stuff? Well, in a sense, Craig can play one of her songs or something, or imitate her in a comedic way, but Craig is Craig, Taylor Swift is Taylor Swift. So also God is God, and what that nature is justice, truth, full light, full knowledge. There's nothing hidden from him. He couldn't hide something from himself. He sees and knows what he is. So therefore, God cannot lie. God cannot act unjustly, because that is his very essence. And so it manifests itself in his nature in this world to be just. And that's what Thomas is saying. It's a nonsense statement to say that man is a donkey, but it's not a nonsense statement to say Socrates sits, because Socrates does, in fact, in his nature, have the ability to sit. God, in his nature, is truth and justice. And justice, in the chess example, or the picking up the rock that he can't carry, is not part of his essential nature. It's again, ridiculous statement, as in saying this man is a donkey. It must, however, be remembered that since every agent produces an effect like itself, to each active power there corresponds a thing possible as its proper object, according to the nature of that act on which its active power is founded. For instance, the power of giving warmth is related as to its proper object to the being capable of being warmed. The divine existence, however, upon which the nature of power in God is founded, is infinite and is not limited to any genus as being, but possesses within itself the perfection of all being. Whence whatsoever has or can have the nature of being is numbered among the absolutely possible things, in respect of which God is called omnipotent. So he can do whatever is just and right to do, essentially. Now, nothing is opposed to the idea of being except non-being. That is again what I'm saying with justice. God cannot lie. A lie is non-being. It's speaking forth something that is not. That's why it's a lie. So being and non-being. God is being itself. Now, nothing is opposed to the idea of being except non-being, says Thomas. Therefore, that which implies being and non-being at the same time is repugnant to the idea of an absolute possible thing within the scope of the divine omnipotence, for such cannot come under the divine omnipotence, not because of any defect in the power of God, quite opposite, that's my addition, the quite opposite part, but because it has not the nature of a feasible or possible thing. Therefore, anything that does not imply a contradiction in terms, again, that's another way of saying what I just said. Anything that does not imply a contradiction in terms is numbered amongst those possible things in respect of which God is called omnipotent. Whereas, whatever implies contradiction does not come within the scope of divine omnipotence. Why? Because it cannot have the aspect of possibility. It is a lie. It is a non-being. It is an emptiness. And he is being itself. Now, that's also could get into deep theology and probably going into Zimzum, as would be said by the Arizal, I think, trying to explain further Kabbalah. And there's a mechoikus or an argument whether he is explaining it more or making up and innovating stuff, I don't know. But anyway, the point is it could get into very much deeper theological, very interesting and illuminating too, conversations. But again, that's out of the purview of this beaver galleon that we're sailing on here. This is just a simple catechesis for beginners, guys. Hence, it is better to say that such things cannot be done than that God cannot do them. Nor is this contrary to the word of the angel saying, no word shall be impossible to God. For whatever implies a contradiction cannot be a word, because no intellect can possibly conceive such a thing. Interesting. It's a nonsensical word, a word salad, which is what society is quickly devolving into, which is what it must happen. Society is a macrocosm of an interior shattering and disorganization of the soul. And so the more souls that become disorganized in themselves start to push out and reflect in society in a mass way out in the street. And that's what we're seeing happening more and more, as has been said would happen by all the prophets and apostles and everybody. So it's going along according to design in order to reach an eventual wholeness, but we're going to have some choppy waters before we get to wholeness. Reply to objection 1. This is Thomas's reply. God is said to be omnipotent in respect to his active power, not to passive power, as was shown above in Article 1. Whence the fact that he is immovable or impassible is not repugnant to his omnipotence. Reply to objection 2. To sin is a fall short of a perfect action. It's to fall short of a perfect action. Hence, to be able to sin is to be able to fall short in action, which is repugnant to omnipotence. Why? Because omnipotence has to do with all being and doing, and sin has to do with not being, not doing, not aligning with virtue. It's a lack. Therefore it is that God cannot sin because of his omnipotence. Nevertheless, the philosopher says that God can deliberately do what is evil, but this must be understood either on a condition, the antecedent of which is impossible. As for instance, if we were to say that God can do evil things if he will. For there is no reason why a conditional proposition should not be true, though both the antecedent and consequent are possible. As if one were to say, if man is a donkey, he has 4 feet. That would be true if the antecedent were true. Man is a donkey, but man's not a donkey, therefore the consequent is not, or the conditional is not true. Or he may be understood to mean that God can do some things which now seem to be evil, which, however, if he did them, would then be good. And that's what Thomas was talking about earlier in God's divine providence, allowing for the mobile, like the metaphor I gave of having a mobile that's like dangling over top of a baby's carriage to amuse the baby. It's lined up and held together, um, but it could be collapsed and broken. This world is sort of collapsed, and God is allowing us to rebuild the mobile with Him so that we can cooperate and have free will and have a relationship. It's all about coming to the point of relationship. Again, that's a big, long teaching, which we don't have time for. Or is He perhaps speaking, when He says He's now talking about Aristotle, or is Aristotle perhaps speaking after the common manner of heathen, because Aristotle was a heathen, who thought that men, and by the way, the word heathen doesn't have a necessary moral implication. Somehow in modern time, when you hear the word heathen, it just means bad person. That's absolutely not true and ridiculous. Many of the heathen were great people, better than religious people. Anyway, that's a different subject. Men of heathen who thought that men became gods, like Jupiter or Mercury. Boy, that was a big interstitial ramble I put in there that made that sound ridiculous. Or he is perhaps speaking of the common way and manner of heathens that thought that men became gods like Jupiter and Mercury. So he's saying that if that's the case, this is what Aristotle meant, but we understand things differently. He's just giving the various ways that it could be understood what Aristotle was saying. Reply to objection 3. God's omnipotence is particularly shown in sparing and having mercy, because in this it is made manifest that God has supreme power, that He freely forgives sin. For it is not for one who is bound by laws of a superior to forgive sins of his own free will. If I go into a store and go into a Apple store and start breaking phones or iPads or something, it's not, the employees cannot forgive that. The owner, perhaps, the CEO of Apple, perhaps, because you're breaking their stuff. That's what he's saying. That God has the ability to forgive our sin. Quite the opposite. It shows His omnipotence. It shows His power, because He is the owner, the big boss, which I should say the big boss is actually the big servant. That's why when God was manifest in human nature, He became a servant to us and allowed us to beat Him and whip Him, and showing what the actual essence of the deity is when we use the word power, unlike Nietzsche's idea of power, which is a fallen, broken, ridiculous way of looking at power. I mean, I shouldn't say ridiculous. It clearly makes sense. And if I'm out here tomorrow and somebody comes up and starts poking at my chest and putting their mouthing off to me, I might knock them out, which is not quite Jesus's way, more Nietzsche's way. And that's probably what I would do. So I shouldn't say ridiculous, unless we want to say that I'm ridiculous, and most of my ex-girlfriends would 100% agree. Okay, or because by sparing and having mercy upon men, He leads them on to the participation of an infinite good, which is the ultimate effect of the divine power. Or because, as was said above in question 21, article 4, the effect of the divine mercy is the foundation of all the divine works. Of course it is, because it's allowing other creatures to exist who by necessity have to be less than Him, which means by necessity have to be less than perfect. It is a divine mercy to allow anything to exist. For nothing is due to anyone except on account of something already given him gratuitously by God. In this way, the divine omnipotence is particularly made manifest, because to it pertains the first foundation of all good things. A lot could be said about that, divine mercy, Sister Faustina, and many beautiful things, but we're almost finished here, and this is just the daily Summa. We're just rolling through this. Someday I may do this in front of other people, and so I'm guessing the classes would go a little bit longer. Right now we're already at 19 minutes. How does this time go like this? Reply to objection 4. The absolute possible is not so called in reference either to higher causes or to inferior causes, but in reference to itself. But the possible in reference to some power is named possible in reference to its proximate cause. Hence, those things which it belongs to God alone to do immediately, for example, to create, to justify, and the like, are said to be possible in reference to a higher cause. We'll finish this objection tomorrow. We've moved on to the other page. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been great to be with you. And I tell you to remember that this is all straw. We're not here to learn a bunch of little factoids. We're here to meditate on the things of God and then pray. So go do that likewise. Have an excellent night, everyone.